The oath that we make today is this, that we will remember them. We've been doing just that over the last few months. A couple of months ago, we remembered in this church a man named Seymour Dallas. You can probably still find one of the little blue books about his life as you go out of the church to the north and to the south. He died 100 years ago, a couple of months ago, and it was a striking experience for me remembering him and being involved in his service and all the events that led up to that remembrance. His link here was that he had come to work as a priest at this church, at St. Mary Abbot's. He arrived when he was more or less precisely the age I was when I arrived 4 months ago. He lasted 6 months, so if I'm not here in a couple of months' time, you'll know I've decided to take the same route, and that is to go over to Canada to found churches in the frozen norths. He was fed up of life in Kensington, and he wanted something with a few more bears. So he went over and he built in 3 years no more than 10 churches, founding not just new communities, but literally chopping trees down and building churches. He wasn't terribly good at it. He sent one letter back to Kensington asking for money to heat the places over the winter. He said it was the natural bowing of the wood that caused there to be gaps in the walls of his churches, not his poor craftsmanship, of course. He came back at the beginning of the war, having spent 3 years there. He went out to be a padre on the front, and he was killed. He was just 4 years older than I am now when he died. He was a young man in whom society had invested so much, whose life was traded for such little gain. I feel like I'm only just setting out on this journey, and yet if my life were his, it would so soon be extinguished. And of course, there were many who never made it to the age I am now. Of course, I'd known about the scale of death during the First World War, about the futile, bloody battles, the earth sown with blood. But I'd learnt something new by immersing myself in Seymour's story, in remembering him. I'd learnt something of what it was like to be me in that narrative. Of course, Seymour's story is just one among many. But as I came to know the man through his letters and the reports that he sent back here, that personal connection brought for me a truth which the raw figures of deaths and casualties never quite managed to convey. He was a man full of promise and of life. Such enormous potential lay within him. It was for me the realization that each person whose life was ended far too early was living a life as vivid and as complex as my own, populated with their own ambitions and their own shortcomings, their friends and their enemies, their routines, their chaos, their worries and their hopes, their sins and their godliness. They were all part of an epic story that continues invisibly around us, like an anthill sprawling deep underground with elaborate passageways to thousands of other lives that you'll never know existed, in which we might appear only once, or never at all, or simply as a dreamt of future generation. For the one man, Seymour, whose story I came to know, how many more were there whose stories have never been told and will never be told? On this day, we make our oath that we will remember them. And I put it to you that this means more than simply remembering their names, more than just remembering their sacrifice and the freedom they won for us. It means remembering their whole humanity, their dreams and aspirations, their acts of bravery, their stomach-churning fear, their moments of weakness, their heartache for those left at home, the pleasure they took in a cup of tea, their grumpiness at their football team being defeated. For me, that was made possible by seeing myself in the man Seymour. For those of us who are teachers, it might help to imagine our response to a class full of orphaned children and those crying to a father they'd never see again. For those of us who are journalists or civic officials, imagine yourselves receiving the accurate reports from the front lines and wondering what on earth you were going to publish the next day and what you'd say in your next speech. For those of us who are doctors and nurses, consider the overwhelming number of wounds that no training could have prepared you for. For those of us who are lawyers, think of opening another will or dividing another estate of yet another teenage boy. Remembrance is concerned with the whole panoply of experience, the rich depth of humanity. And remembrance is an ongoing process. Remembrance is the retelling of their lives to the generations to come. The work of remembrance falls upon each of our shoulders to pass on that which we have received, that it may not be lost. And finally, remembrance means speaking and acting in a way that shows that our remembrance makes a difference in the way that we live. Living out the fact that our existence is changed because of what has come before. No doubt, remembrance involves lamenting and mourning and weeping, but not because of what we're experiencing now, but because of what others experienced, so that we might now enjoy the lives that we do. Remembering that our lives are intimately tied up with so many others, and never forgetting that some of our joy is built on their sorrows. And it's remembering the cost of the wars in which we engage. We heard Christ saying today that his commandment to us is to love one another. That no greater love hath this than a man to lay down his life. It's remembering that war is far too great a cost to satisfy our cravings and our wants and our desires. That it is much better to be on the side of love, much better to lay down our lives than cause someone else to lay down theirs. And that means having the humility to sacrifice our own desires, our own greed, when we know that it will lead to violence and to hurt. Honouring the remembrance of those who have died means acknowledging their sacrifice, retelling their stories, and living like it makes a difference. That is what we commend when we join in our oath of remembrance. Amen.